Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa ashabihi wa man tabi'ahum bi isanin ila yawmiddin wa ba'd. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome once again to another session looking at the life of the great Imam Imaduddin al-Wasiti rahimahullah ta'ala and his legacy. And of course we have jumped into a rather juicy topic beginning last week, discussing desires and lusts, obsessions of the sexual nature, that is. From the lens of Imam al-Ghazali's Iḥyāʻ we continue tonight with a quick recap. We left off Imam al-Ghazali. Of course, the Iḥyāʻ was a book very familiar to Imam al-Wasiti, one of the few books that he found to be spiritually inspiring among his community there in the marshlands of Iraq and Wasit, among the various deviations and distorted practices, a lack of real spiritual and religious grounding. It were these books, like Risālah al-Qushayriyyah and Qutb al-Qulūb, etc., that carried Imam al-Wasiti until he was able to leave and embark upon a journey of knowledge and spiritual development. So, as I mentioned the last time, we were looking at ishq as an obsession. It's a form of love that's gone beyond balance. Begins as something natural, as described by Imam al-Ghazali, maybe something even beautiful, but grows in excess, turning into an obsession to the point that your desire takes over your intellect, such that your intellect now is in the service of your desires, as opposed to your desire being reined in and governed by your intellect. And this can, of course, destroy a person's faith. He describes this one as the most dangerous distortion of love, obsession, ishq, when a person becomes so fixated on one object of affection that they lose all sense of moderation. And he says this is worse than the state of animals, because an animal will be content once they've fulfilled that urge, wherever they fulfill it, whereas a person who has fallen into this type of obsession will not be satisfied until it is with their object of obsession. And until that happens, the person is overtaken by this obsession. They will remain restless. They will be humiliated in the process and spiritually stunted or bound, meaning constricted. So, just with that recap, Imam al-Ghazali, he goes on to talk about this ishq or obsession, and he says that it's nothing but the overflow of excessive lust. It's a sickness of an empty heart devoid of higher purpose, and one must guard against its beginnings. This is an important part here of his, I should say, framework, if you will, in that you guard against its beginnings before obsession takes root. That happens by shunning or avoiding repeated glances and recurring thoughts. Okay? And we've talked about lowering the gaze in previous sessions that were founded based on the Hanbali legal code. And Islam in general, as we know that lowering the gaze is a command from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then we looked at the details as to what is permissible to look at of the opposite gender and of the same gender, etc. So now we're talking about this from a spiritual lens to see how this can impact us on that level. So here the concept is not just following the law, but also incorporating a spiritual awareness. And here is not only the act of glancing and looking, but now we're taking this to the next level, which would be considered like the muraqabah level, which is the vigilance of minding your thoughts such that you do not allow them to run wild. Okay? Many of us know, we understand, we kind of grow up with the teaching that you're not held accountable for the thoughts that you have, it's just the acts that you do. But the thoughts that we have, if they're left to fester, will lead to actions. The more we allow the mind to just roam freely in the world of imagination and suggestion, eventually that leads us to action. It's the power, think about it for a minute. The power of advertising is based on planting a seed of a thought in your mind, until eventually that grows and grows and you let it run wild, and you got to have that thing. Oh, I can't live until I get that thing. And then what happens? Normally, buyer's remorse sets in. You get that thing and you go, man, it's really not what I thought it was going to be. It's not all what it was cracked up to be. And now I've got this thing. I've really just lost myself in it. I've spent hours looking and researching and reading and visiting and touching and enjoying, and I got it, and now I don't really want it anymore. That's for halal things, by the way. So imagine the sinful thing. Right away. So that's where we have to manage the thoughts as well. And it all begins with the initial glance. Avoiding the repeated glance. Once it takes hold, he says, once it takes hold, driving it away becomes very difficult. The same holds for attachment to wealth, status, property, and children, even for the love of trifling diversions such as birds or backgammon and chess. They take hold until an obsession develops. Even games and bird watching is something perhaps more popular in the older days when we weren't screen watching. We were doing other types of watching. Even those trivial things, they can form into obsessions. They can dominate a person until they spoil both religion and worldly life, until the person cannot bear to be apart from them. And today we can think about like social media, for example, or we can think about video games as another one, where we're plagued by these things, where once we get into them, it's almost impossible to get out. We get trapped and stuck. The one who curbs obsession at its first appearance, he says, is like a rider. As his animal heads toward a doorway, all he has to do is lightly draw the reins and turn it to the side before it enters. It just takes a simple tug. But once the animal, the beast, is allowed to enter the doorway, passing beyond its threshold, the rider now has to grab it by the tail and attempt to drag it backwards with all of their might, typically unable to move it an inch. He says how vast the difference is between ease and hardship in these two cases. The first case, just a little tug on the reins, divert it from entering in. You're fine, no problem. The other one, you've let it go in, now you're trying to pull it out. It's a metaphor, certainly, and I think you can understand where he's going with it. Yeah, it's just too late. The deal is done. So take precautions at the beginning of affairs. As for their endings, they admit no cure except with grueling effort, nearly to the wrenching of the soul. Excessive desire is when it overmasters the intellect to this degree. And that is gravely blameworthy, he says. Its deficiency through impotence or through weakness, meaning talking about sensual desire that fails to grant the spouse her due enjoyment, is also blameworthy. Note here we're looking at extremes, right? One is where you can't control your lusts and you're basically entering every doorway that's presented to you. And the other one is where you're so weak or so disinterested, while being married you can't fulfill your spouse's rights. He says what's praiseworthy is this, that desire is moderate, obedient to reason and the sacred law. It contracts and expands at their command, meaning you have control. Your desire will strengthen when needed and will weaken when needed based on the context of your situation, based on the legal code and spiritual subtlety of Islam. That's, he says, the only time in which this desire is praiseworthy. Whenever it overreaches, he says, you have to break it by either hunger or by marriage. The Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, O young men, whoever among you is able to marry, let him marry, and whoever is not able, let him fast, for fasting is a restraint for him. So here Imam al-Ghazali essentially in this passage gives us 4 key lessons. The first is guard the heart early. Stop the attachment before it settles. Basically, al-wiqaya khayrun min al-ilaj. Right? Prevention is the best medicine. Okay? The number 2 point is seek balance, not suppression. Desire is a part of human nature. We talked about that at the very beginning, why it's been instilled in us. The goal is to discipline it and not necessarily to destroy it. Number 3 is to avoid both extremes. Excess desire corrupts the soul, while deficiency neglects faithful needs and duties. And then, number 4, marriage as the remedy. When self-discipline and fasting, look here, when self-discipline and fasting no longer suffice, marriage becomes the path to stability, chastity, and spiritual protection, if the marriage is also managed. And we're going to talk about that perhaps in a later session. So we have a general idea about marriage as a potential means, fasting as a shield, and then what this obsession can look like. What does marriage look like within the legal code? We haven't addressed that. According to the school of the Hanabila, marriage, as we know, many of us talk about marriage as a unrestricted sunnah. You have to get married. We use hadith like complete half of your deen. Completing half of your deen, by the way, that hadith is referring to another hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ, he says, whoever can guarantee for me what is between their cheeks and what is between their thighs, I'll guarantee for them Jannah. Right, so marriage guarantees what is between the thighs, meaning your chastity is protected by way of marriage. That's half of your deen. The other half is up here. If you can guarantee that, then you would have secured the other half of your religion. It doesn't mean that in order to be a true, full person of Iman, you have, it's like a condition to your Islam to be married. No, that's what it's talking about there. And so in general, Islam is marriage is a sunnah, a recommended sunnah, of course. It's the sunnah that Allah has established, as we've discussed, to perpetuate the human race. And we know from the major overarching objectives of Islam is hifd al-nasl, which is to preserve lineage. Through marriage is how that happens. When you have children, to have them within the confines of a marriage contract is how you preserve the lineage. Also, al-ard, to preserve somebody's honor and dignity. That happens by way of marriage when you want to exercise these types of, or you want to act in these ways within the framework of what is considered honorable and dignified. But the actual ruling of marriage depends on the person's situation. If it's going to be wajib or mustahab, or it's just mubah, or it's makruh, or it's haram. Right? So according to the Hanabila, marriage is recommended for someone with sexual desires who is not afraid they will commit illicit sexual activity. It's recommended for those not afraid. Recommended. It is preferred in this case over being free for voluntary worship. It is simply allowed, it's like mubah for someone without desire, as the intent for marriage is to preserve one's chastity, to have children, and increase their lineage. And in this case, being free for voluntary worship is preferred over marriage because they're likely unable to suffice their spouse in preserving their chastity, meaning the other person they're marrying. If they have no interest, I have no desire for this. I'm busy with other things. My desire for other things is much greater than this. Means that if I get married to this person and they have a desire that I can't fulfill, I'm opening them up to potentially stray and go seek to fulfill that desire in an unlawful manner. So in this case, the person that does not have this desire, does not have this intent, then for them, voluntary worship is preferred over marriage. They're also likely to face obligations and rights that they cannot fulfill, and in turn be distracted from seeking knowledge and worship with something of no benefit. If you can't fulfill the rights, don't pursue. It's obligatory to get married due to an oath or for someone who can marry and fears they will fornicate. This is when it becomes an obligation. When you're at the brink of falling into illicit sexual relations, fornication, when you're at, or if you're a man, for example, and you've married one wife and now you're at the brink of committing adultery because that's not working out in the way that you need, your desires are not being fulfilled, and in this case, you may be obliged to marry again, meaning a second wife in this case. Okay, so that's important to note when it comes to the ruling of getting married. And so that's important when we're discussing the topic with various different people in our community, especially young people. A lot of times the first go-to is get married, get married, get married. We need to understand, where's the person at? What's their situation? What's the likelihood? What's their ability? What's the etc.? Otherwise, it's, listen, I understand. There might be some desires. Right now is not your time. You're not capable. You can't handle the duty, responsibility, all of those things. So what do? You break that desire with hunger and a multitude of other tools that can help you out along the way. This is where I thought it would be interesting if we take a case study of several notable scholars. From the Hanbali, of course. From the great Imams of the school, known to have remained unmarried or to have postponed marriage until later in life. And this was typically because of their complete dedication to seeking knowledge and serving the faith. 3 scholars I'll mention, and there's more than this. Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, the founder of the school himself, passed away in 241. Famously postponed marriage until around the age of 40. He said himself, I did not marry until after 40. And that's because he was absorbed in study during his days of youth. Historical records mention that he was intensely engaged in learning hadith and travel in pursuit of knowledge. He traveled all over in seek or in search of the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. It's a very powerful story, great Imam Ahmad, that he would travel, even meeting Imam al-San'ani in Mecca during Hajj. He used to go, he performed Hajj 5 times according to historic record. And when he would go, he would meet with the great Imams and scholars and they would share hadith narrations. And he was interested in finding an isnad al-ali, which is the short chain of narration. Because he would say, the higher the chain of narration or the shorter it is, the less likely there's an error. And so some of the transmissions from Imam Ahmad are only disconnected from the Prophet by 3 or 4 narrators. Imam al-San'ani was one of those that had the sanad al-ali. So when he was there in Mecca with Imam al-San'ani, instead of sitting and asking for hadith narrations, he said, I'm going to wait so that I can travel to Yemen in order to receive these narrations from the source in his hometown. And so he would journey, instead of right there, he would journey to Yemen, making a perilous trip in order to visit with this great Imam. Not only was it Yemen, Mecca, Medina, Hijaz, but he traveled to the other great cities of knowledge and the hadith narrators to collect. By the end of his journey, they said he memorized 1 million narrations. So by 40, he got married. Ibn al-Jawzi, he's busy, man. We're getting a million narrations. Yeah. We're not running errands, bro. Ibn al-Jawzi notes that Imam Ahmad was so devoted to sacred knowledge that he did not busy himself with earning a living or marriage until he attained what he intended. That was another great note of Imam Ahmad was his father passed away before he was born or shortly around that time and left them a piece of property, like real estate, that they rented out. And they rented it out for 17 dinars or something like that. A very modest income. 17, it's like very modest income. And that was the income that he maintained pretty much throughout his entire life. Managing that piece of property that his father left behind. Almost like an endowment for his path to knowledge. And every once in a while he would take odd jobs copying manuscripts for people's personal libraries, as many of the great scholars did. Once he did marry, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blessed him with two sons, Salih and Abdullah. They, of course, became scholars, reputable representatives of their father, occupying various different positions. And he married this woman and stayed married to her for about 30 years until she passed away. He said, we did not have a single argument through the entire marriage. That's what happens when you wait till you're 40. You're too tired to be messing around with arguments. Another one of the great Imams, Taqiyuddin Ahmad ibn Taymiyyah, known as Shaykh al-Islam, who passed away in 728, prominent Hanbali theologian and jurist, never married at all. Biographers remark that Ibn Taymiyyah led an exceptionally busy life of teaching, writing, issuing fatwa, debating, and even fighting in the battles against the Mongols, in addition to enduring several sentences in jail. He was imprisoned on more than one occasion. Some of them, most of them, based on his own religious convictions that went against the grain. And so he was in prison for that. And because of these responsibilities consuming his entire life and the hardships that he faced, he did not marry, nor did he take a concubine. Someone might say, well, you know, back then they had that option, but he didn't even do that. Throughout his life, it's recorded that he spent his time entirely dedicated to scholarship and religious service. Ibn Abdul Hadi writes that Ibn Taymiyyah would not turn to anything besides studying for this reason, and because of years of jihad that occupied him and the jail terms that he suffered, he never married. It's important to note, Ibn Taymiyyah, though he didn't marry, he didn't oppose marriage. This wasn't a we're anti-marriage thing. They understood very well and certain that marriage was the Prophet's sunnah as it was the prophets that came before. It was his circumstances and his desire, his intention to avoid this responsibility, so he remained celibate. It was like an excuse for him. He prioritized public duties. It wasn't out of a disregard for this sunnah of marriage, but because he felt there were things that needed to be handled that would render him perhaps incapable of fulfilling these rights and duties. Another one of the great Imams, Nasr ibn Fityan al-Nahrawani, known as Ibn al-Manni. He passed away in 583, before Ibn Taymiyyah. One of the foremost students of Abu al-Hasan ibn al-Zaghuni. We've talked about him in several sessions. If that doesn't ring a bell, this might give you some context. He was a revered faqih, jurist of the Hanbali school in Baghdad. The Hanbali jurists, this is mentioned by Imam al-Dhahabi. The Hanbali jurists of today across the various lands refer back to him and his companions for fiqh because it has spread through the teachers and books of two sheikhs. Muwaffiquddin ibn Qudama al-Maqdisi, we know Ibn Qudama, passed away in 620, and Majduddin ibn Taymiyyah al-Harrani, 653. That's the grandfather of Ibn Taymiyyah, al-Majd. He says, as for Sheikh Muwaffiquddin, he was his student, the student of Ibn al-Manni. And as for al-Majd, he was the student of his student, Abu Bakr Muhammad ibn al-Hallawi. So basically he's saying that Ibn al-Manni was one of the primary references by which all of the madhab refers back to, because of Ibn Qudama and al-Majd. Ibn Qudama and al-Majd are like, if you think about the Hanbali school, okay, if you were to list like 1, 2, 3, the top 5 of the most influential scholars of the madhab, Ibn Qudama and al-Majd are 1 and 2. And this, Ibn al-Manni was the teachers of these two, either by direct contact or by way of one student in the middle. He remained unmarried for his entire life, deliberately choosing a path of zuhud. There's one account notes that he taught and gave fatwa for about 70 years. And in all that time did not marry nor take a concubine. Ibn al-Manni went beyond just foregoing marriage in this life. He also shunned all sorts of luxury and comfort. There are narrations that said that he never rode a mule or a horse, never owned a slave, nor wore fine clothes, subsisting instead on very simple food like water-soaked boiled beans. And whatever any money that came to him would be immediately distributed to his students and his companions. And this level of austerity, this was his personal way, his personal choice that allowed him to focus entirely on teaching, worship, and devotion without the attachments of family or worldly desires and goods. Okay, I'll give you an idea. But if you're not going to aim for that, if the hemma is not that high, if your desires aren't in that direction, then you don't need to put yourself through such rigors, right? This is exceptions to the case, if you will. Great imams of the tradition, these scholars, and there's more that are like this. Imam al-Nawawi, for example, is not from the Hanbali school. That's why I didn't mention him. Otherwise, he's a prime example. Imam al-Nawawi passed away young, never married. And many of us, it's a household name, Imam al-Nawawi, Riyadh al-Salihin. Everybody knows that. Arba'in al-Nawawiyah, 40 hadith of Imam Nawawi. Everybody knows that. He never got married. And he left behind a legacy for the ummah, continues to be beneficial not only to us, but to him as well, inshallah. Again, it's not because they disdained marriage, but it was because their direction and their path was one which would not sustain having to handle those responsibilities. So what about the spiritual aspirant? Not somebody that's aiming for this level of scholarship, but someone that does want to be on the spiritual path. What should they do regarding marriage? This is where we jump back to Imam al-Ghazali. He says that at the beginning of the path, the spiritual aspirant, which is the Murid. We talked about the Murid as opposed to the Murad. The Murid is the one that's journeying, the one that is struggling, the one that is learning and trying to apply their knowledge, whereas the Murad is the one that Allah has pulled within His care, is sought after by the divine. The Murid now, he says, should not preoccupy themselves with marriage at the beginning of the path, for it is an absorbing distraction that hinders the journey. It draws him toward companionship with a wife, and whoever seeks intimacy with other than Allah is diverted from Allah. The beginning of the path, you don't have the stability in your spiritual development in order to handle that level of love and devotion. It can easily spiral out of control, leading to an obsession with that individual. It can recalibrate the direction of your heart, is basically what we're getting at here. Why it's sound advice, according to Imam al-Ghazali, to wait until you become more stable along your spiritual journey. He says, do not let the Prophet's many marriages mislead you, for nothing in this world ever occupied his heart away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He says, for this reason, Abū Sulaymān al-Dārānī, he said, whoever marries has inclined toward the world. Mala ila dunya. And I have not seen, he said, I have not seen an aspirant, a murid, who married and remained upon his first state. the initial spiritual state, which is put you on the path. You're just on the path. There's a spiritual awakening that's happened, perhaps some repentance, and now there's a level of muhasabah that's happening. You're taking yourself to account, and now you're going to adorn yourself with the rights and obligations of Islam and refrain from the sins. He says, I haven't seen someone that's just started out on the path that got married that stayed that way, because they're not stable. He was once told how much you need a woman to keep you company, and he replied, may Allah not make me find intimacy in her. Meaning intimacy with her would bar intimacy with Allah. He would block me from that. He also said, whatever distracts you from Allah, whether it's family, wealth, or children, is an evil omen against you. Whatever distracts you from Allah. And that's based in the Quran. This is some far off, like crazy concept that even your own family, your wealth, your children, it can be a fitna, because it can lead you to temptations, basically giving in to pleasures, to sins, allowing them to just run amok because of your love for them. You let them run wild. Abū Sulaymān al-Dārānī, by the way, his full name Abdurrahman ibn Ahmad al-Dārānī, was an early Syrian ascetic, spiritual master born in the town of Darya near Damascus. He lived in the 2nd and early 3rd generation, dying in 215. He was among the tabi'in. He was known as Hakim al-Sham, the sage of Syria. Had deep insights into the states of the heart, and his sayings on sincerity, vigilance, muraqabah, and divine love were widely quoted by later Sufis like al-Junayd, and as we can see, Imām al-Ghazali. He was known for extreme watchfulness over his heart. He would say, I do not leave a single breath to pass without being mindful of Allah in it. And his emphasis that true zuhud was not about abandoning the world, but being free from its hold. And this is also the view of Imam Ahmad, that a person could be zahid while having wealth, so long as the wealth hadn't grasped a hold of their heart. Essentially, the measure was, you are who you are regardless of whether you have it or you don't. Then you know it hasn't taken hold of your heart. If you have it, you're the same. If you don't have it, you're the same. Your objective is one, constant and steady, and that is Allah. He says, Imam al-Ghazali, how then can anyone be compared to the Messenger of Allah, whose absorption in the love of Allah was so intense that it was at times feared for his very body. He would place his hand upon Aisha's thigh and say, speak to me, O Aisha, seeking relief from the overwhelming state that overtook him, for his human frame could only bear so much of that divine intimacy. Meaning, that was an escape, a relief from the intense divine love that he had with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Imam al-Ghazali, he says, his natural state was closeness to Allah. His closeness to creation was only incidental, an act of mercy toward his body, even though he could not remain long among the people. And we know that, as Imam al-Ghazali points out, whenever he would start to feel constricted, he would say, رَيِّحْنَا بِهَا Ya Bilal. Give us rest and comfort by it, O Bilal. Meaning, we need salah. Go back to prayer, back to Allah. When we're tired of the dunya, overwhelmed with that, now we need what would return him to what he found, the coolness of his eye, if you will. So, Imam al-Ghazali says, whoever, while they are weak, measures themselves against the Prophet in such matters, they've been deceived. For human understanding cannot grasp the secrets of his states. The aspirant's condition at the beginning of the path is therefore celibacy, until he becomes strong in his awareness of Allah, so long as lust does not overpower him, leaving room for those that are having a hard time, struggling with those desires. He says if lust does overpower him, he should break it with prolonged hunger and constant fasting. Meaning you don't just go, oh, I have the desire, let me just run to this to get married. No, first you start by pumping the brakes. Pump the brakes. Throw in something in the way. Fasting. Constant fasting. Even if that does not subdue it, he cannot and he cannot safeguard his gaze. So again, lower the gaze, fast, exercise some control over your thoughts, safeguard yourself. And if you're unable to do it after all of those steps, it's like, look, it's a problem in marriages today. And sometimes the husband will use the ayah and strike them. Right? In the middle of like a heated argument or something, they'll jump right to that. And they'll want to put their hands on their spouse. But you know, prior to that, there's all these other mechanisms that you're supposed to utilize in order to avoid getting to that extreme, having to go that far. There needs to be some boycotting. You need to stop talking. You need to turn your back. You need to seek counseling. You need to advice and counsel. You need to go through all these steps before you jump to that end. And essentially, here's the same. Right? If you're trying to develop a spiritual life, obviously, granted, if you're not married already, if you're married, there's no hope for you. You're lost. Get up now and go home. Khalas. What are you doing here? Right? We're done. Cooked. No, there's still hope. Hope for everybody. The husbands and the wives, by the way. It's not just a wife bashing. We're not wife bashing here or lady bashing. No, the women can apply essentially the same thing in reverse. We should understand that. Right? The woman needs to consider the same thing in the reverse way. Because when a woman gets married, then now she's strapped with all types of household duties. And one of them is going to be having kids and then raising kids. So there's a lot that goes into preparing the person for that. And we're going to look at some stories, inshallah, of the righteous women and how they manage these types of things, perhaps in later sessions. However, here, Imam al-Ghazali is pointing us to something important, that for the spiritual aspirant, the Murid, that's not yet married, they need to consider these practices and protocols in order to subdue that desire before they jump into starting something that perhaps will lead them off the path. And then he reminds us that the adultery of the eye is among the gravest of the lesser sins. And it leads inevitably to the greater obscenity, the adultery of the private parts. So whoever cannot restrain his gaze will not be able to restrain his private parts. Again, going back to lowering the gaze. The great Al-Masih, Isa ibn Maryam alayhi salam, the great prophet and messenger, min ulul azm, it was reported that he said, beware the glance, for it plants desire in the heart, and that alone suffices as a trial. It was said to Iḥyāʻ alayhi salam, what is the beginning of adultery? And he said, the gaze and wishing. Al-Fudayl, we understand the great leader of the path, said, Iblis says, it is my old bow and arrow that never misses, meaning the gaze. Bullseye every time. Just get that gaze working, and it'll go straight to the heart. And the Messenger, alayhi salatu wasalam, he said, the glance is a poisoned arrow from the arrows of Iblis. Whoever leaves it out of fear of Allah, Allah grants him faith, whose sweetness he finds in his heart. He also said, alayhi salatu wasalam, I have not left after me any trial more harmful to men than those who will not be named. Women, of course. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, beware the trials of this world and the trial of women, for the first trial of the children of Israel came by way of women. Again, we have to understand the nature of what this means. It means the temptation that men feel from gazing upon a woman. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made us that way, that we've been tempted in that way. Again, back to that idea that the visual aid for men is extremely important. The visual aid, the stimulation, that's where it starts, by way of looking upon the beauty that Allah has put in women, beautified them for men. And shaitan will magnify that beauty, sometimes in ways that's like a mirage. It's not even that way. It doesn't even look that way. But shaitan will make it appear as a mirage so that you'll take another glance. Something passes this way, and shaitan puts his little thing on it. He says, ooh, wait a second. And then you look and you go, oh, that's nothing like what I just thought was happening over here in my peripheral. I was trying to be strong, but shaitan put a little mirage on it, and now I went and took a second glance and realized that's not even, I'm seeing two different things. Yeah. And there are narrations from the Prophet, that's how shaitan does. Shaitan essentially, there's one narration that says something to this degree that shaitan will ride on the woman's back and beautify her from that angle, such that when she walks by, you think you see something that is attractive to the eye, when in reality, there's nothing there. It's normal. Or less than that. But you take the second glance. Whoosh, sin. Done. Check. Got one. Right? Because the first glance is for you, the second glance is against you, as we've discussed. So if we can get you to continuously do that and create the habit and the desire, eventually it's not just going to be a glance. You're going to just start gawking at women. You're going to start staring. And today, unfortunately, the world that we have, is the access to that is at our fingertips right here. We can just not even like take a glance. We can just absorb ourselves into the world of undressed bodies, which can be very destructive. Studies show it's a very destructive habit. We're talking about spiritual destruction. We understand that, but we're talking about social destruction. Those types of habits can lead you down a very, very dark, destructive path, right? So the fornication of the eye is the glance. And that's why we're commanded in the Quran in Surah An-Nur, verse number 30, tell the believing men to lower their gaze. The Prophet ﷺ, he says that every son of Adam has his share of adultery. The two eyes commit adultery, and their adultery is the gaze. The two hands commit adultery, and their adultery is touching. The 2 feet commit adultery, and their adultery is walking to it. And the mouth commits adultery, and its adultery is the kiss. The heart entertains and desires, and the private parts confirm that or they deny it. So we have to restrain our eyes. Not only men are obliged to restrain their eyes, but believe it or not, women are also obliged to restrain their eyes. And you find this narrated from Salama. She said that Ibn Maktoum, the blind man, sought permission to enter the home of the Messenger ﷺ. She said, I was there along with Maymuna. We were sitting with him, and the Prophet ﷺ said, observe veiling, observe the hijab, meaning put something up. It didn't mean put on a scarf, like get behind a screen. And we said, is he not blind? He can't see us. The Prophet said, are you too blind such that you can't see him? Meaning you also have to observe, maybe, you never know. Even women can fall into this issue. They can be tempted as well. Indicating that women are not permitted to sit with blind men, in this case, obviously, as he notes, has become customary at funerals and banquets, etc. Seclusion of a blind man with a woman is prohibited, and it is prohibited for a woman to sit with a blind man and fix her gaze upon him without need. Women are permitted to speak to men and look at them due to the generality of need, and we've discussed that previously. Right? Women are permitted to look at men if there's a need. And the moment there's there's a lack of any need or there's a desire present, then much like men, they'd have to lower their gaze. And if one can restrain their eyes from women, but cannot, he goes on to the next thing, which is very important for us looking at Imam al-Wasi's situation. He says, if someone can restrain their eyes from looking at women, meaning a man, but cannot restrain them from looking at young boys, then marriage is preferable for him. For the danger regarding boys is greater. If his heart inclines towards a woman, he can lawfully gain access to her through marriage. But to look at the face of a boy with desire is unlawful, and there's no path for making that halal. Anyone whose heart is affected by the beauty of a beardless young boy, such that he perceives a difference between him and a bearded man, may not lawfully look at him. You could look at a bearded man, look at another grown man and think, that's a handsome guy. Right? Much like Imam al-Ghazali points out, you could look at an object in nature and you could say, that's a beautiful thing. You could see something, a tree, a sunset, a mountain, whatever, a river or a creek or something, you say, this is beautiful. But it doesn't stir within you sensuality. You're not turned on by it. Like a man could look at another man and think, handsome or beautiful. but there's no lust. But when there is, you look at an older man and there's not, that reaction doesn't happen, but you look at a younger boy and you think, not only beautiful, but there's some tingling happening here, then the ruling is the same as looking at a woman in the sexual way. Same thing. It's impermissible to look at. One of the early successors, they said, I fear nothing more for a young ascetic than a handsome, beardless boy who sits with him. Sufyan al-Thawri, he said, if a man were to toy with a boy, even between his toes, with lustful intent, it's sodomy. And some of the early righteous said, there will arise in this ummah 3 types of sodomites, one who looks, one who touches, and one who commits the act. And so, the affliction of looking upon youthful faces, it is severe. Meaning when you have this sexual desire, whenever a person is unable to restrain his gaze and discipline his thoughts, correct his course of action is to break that desire through marriage. For there are some souls whose yearning cannot be quieted by hunger alone. Right, we have to remember the context of Imam al-Ghazali here. It's describing a kind of attraction that was common in earlier societies. At least that's the way they described it. You can see it rampant in Imam al-Wasi's community and others, such that that particular tariqah became known as those that corrupted young boys for whatever reason. If you remember that men and women, they lived largely apart in those societies. Physical beauty, especially the face, was openly observed. And a beardless boy was often, I shouldn't say often, but was sometimes looked upon in that way as beauty. And then there were those that were afflicted by this sexual attraction. It wasn't like an identity that it is today, where you're born this way and so you can act this way. It doesn't even really matter if you're born with an inclination. What matters is that you adhere to the legal code of your faith. We all have temptations and desires. They might not be that kind, but they might be others. We might be inclined to other things which are sinful. And we might think, look, I was born this way. I have a natural tendency to want to be social. And when I'm social, I end up running my mouth. And when I run my mouth, I did that to the end of it. Right? Right? So we have to remember the context here. And then, of course, his prescription for that, which is getting married in the event that that desire cannot be suppressed or quieted. Even in this case, you might be thinking, well, wait a minute, today, if you told somebody who had this inclination towards being, having these homosexual tendencies, you say, look, they don't want to get married to a woman. You have to remember Lut alayhi salam. When confronted with corruption of this nature, what did he offer as the medicine for it? What did he say? Marry these daughters of mine. Yeah, that's the solution to your problem. Marry these women. That's the way Allah made you. Made you for this. Solve your desires with this. But again, we go back to that obsession piece, the ishq. When a person's become obsessed over this, then that's not attractive. And today, that's exactly what you're dealing with that community, is a sexual obsession. It's a disease of obsession that, as we described, beyond animalistic, because I can't be satisfied unless it's this way. If you think about, have you heard of any other group of people that their whole identity rests upon their sexual preference and orientation? They celebrate. Brothers, you're in front of me now. How many of you walk around making sure everyone knows that you're a heterosexual? Everyone, I like women. I don't base my identity on my sexual preferences. That's a private part of my life. I don't need for you to celebrate the way I want to have sex. I don't need your approval. I don't even want you to know about it. I mean, I have kids, obviously, but I don't want you in my business. But this particular group of people, the obsession is to such a degree that everyone has to know this is what we do. This is what we live for. This is our life. This defines us. This choice, this preference, this orientation, everything about it, this is who we are. That's an obsession. So yeah, of course, Lut alayhi salam would not be able to break through to people like this because of the obsession. It might not be because of the inclination. The inclination can be solved. If it was not solvable, the Prophet Lut alayhi salam would not have suggested it as the course to recorrect. But it is a solvable problem. You can fulfill yourself or your desires in a permissible way. Right? We discussed. That need, Imam al-Ghazali says, it's like a pain. All you're trying to do is relieve yourself of that pain or that burden. And when it's relieved, you're good. But if you worship that obsession, well, the heart of the problem is not at your sexual inclination. It's at this object of obsession that you've taken that's clouded your ability to see clearly. And so, that's where we get back to this trying to strike a balance. And that's all the time we have for this evening. We'll pick up here, inshallah, next time. Dive deeper into some more of these topics by the great Imam al-Ghazali. And then we'll move into the conditions to start a marriage for the aspirant or the Murid on their journey in order for it to be continuous along the way. Till next time, Jazakallah khair for your attendance and your attentive listening. Wa sallallahu wa sallam ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa akhiru da'wana.